Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Fellows in Focus. This is a part of a series of events in which we highlight and celebrate the work of some of NIST's social impact fellows. NIST is an institute focused on addressing critical social and global challenges from an interdisciplinary perspective. We aim to realize real and positive change by combining the sciences, technology, arts, humanities, and social sciences to solve complex problems. I am Hallam Stevens. I'm an associate professor in the history department at NTU and also the associate director of NIST. And today I have with me Una Tsrulneva, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at NIST. And together we're here to discuss an exciting new book by one of our fellows, Ian McGonigle, and you can in fact see the book in Ian's background right there. Let me briefly introduce Ian. Ian is Nanyang Assistant Professor of Global Science, Technology and Society in the Sociology Division at NTU. He obtained, in fact, 2 PhDs. He has a PhD in biochemistry from Cambridge, which he obtained in 2010. And then he trained further in cultural anthropology, receiving an MA from the University of Chicago, and then a PhD from the anthropology department at Harvard in 2018. Ian's work examines identity formation and nation building, particularly in the Middle East, and particularly, as we'll talk about today, with respect to genomics and genetics. His new book just come out, published by MIT Press, takes up these topics. It's called Genomic Citizenship, as you can partly see there, the Molecularization of Identity in the Contemporary Middle East. It is based on extensive ethnographic work in Qatar and Israel, and paints a fascinating picture of how Zionism, Jewishness, and Qatari identity and nationalism and citizenship are being reframed through biomedicine. Let me, with that brief introduction, hand over to Una now to begin the conversation.
Thank you for your introduction, Hallam. And immediately, I would like to start with asking about your unique research background, Ian. You were trained in biochemistry and later switched to philosophical anthropology, from studying neurotransmitters to understanding questions of national identity. So can you tell us a bit about what brought you to this confluence of research directions?
Sure, thank you, Una, and thanks also Hallam and to Vanessa and to everybody at NIST for putting this on. It's a real pleasure, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Yeah, it's not immediately obvious why somebody would come from Ireland and then study biology and biochemistry at graduate level and then end up in the Middle East asking questions about identity. So I'll try and explain that trajectory somewhat biographically. So I grew up in Ireland, and we have the British education system. So after high school, I ended up studying biochemistry, not really sure what I was going to do with that. And, you know, coming out of college with the honors degree in biochemistry, we were kind of steered towards research. And essentially, I found myself pursuing interests in pharmacology, neuroscience. I was kind of interested in drugs, and I was kind of interested in neuroscience. And I ended up in the University of Cambridge doing biochemistry research towards a PhD. But it was almost immediately after I started doing graduate work in the biosciences that I started to get really interested in cultural anthropology. And I suppose part of the reason that happened was that I was situated in a college in Cambridge that had quite a rich history in anthropology. So I was in King's College, which had several famous British anthropologists, and there were a lot of interesting events going on in cultural anthropology, also in history and philosophy of science. So I got alerted to different ways of thinking about science, let's say, while I was doing laboratory research. At the same time, I was getting more and more interested in cultural anthropology. I was interested in shamanism and interested in cultural difference. And while I was doing experiments in the lab with drugs on cells, I was reading all about how in the Amazon, for example, the shamanic healers use different plants to heal illness, but that they have a completely different understanding of the rationality that underpins how these drugs actually work. They often think of plant spirits animating healing. So I kind of was perturbed by this, let's say, the way in which cultural difference configures how different communities actually understand how biology works. And this was a sort of a curiosity, an itch that I wanted to scratch. So when I was finishing my PhD in biochemistry, I kind of decided, you know, this is something I want to do full time. And I essentially wrote a research proposal about shamanism and ontologies and epistemology. And basically, this was my justification to switch from the sciences to anthropology. But shortly after starting graduate work in anthropology, I realized that, you know, I had a lot of philosophical interests, but I needed to find a project that you could do empirically. So I needed to find a project that I could, you know, interview scientists or interview a tribe, let's say, and something that would be more feasible to ethnographic research, which is the method in anthropology. And, you know, ethnographic research sounds very fancy, but it essentially means hanging out and doing things. So you join the tribe or the community that you're interested in studying. And for me, this ended up being a group of geneticists. How I came to genetics, I suppose I can explain a little bit. You know, it also has some grounding in my previous experience. I was doing experiments on neurotransmitter receptors in the lab, and part of that work involved making mutants. So this involves reading the genetic code for a particular gene that codes for a protein, trying to figure out how that genetic code relates to the way the protein works, and then making purposeful mutations to the code. And during those kinds of experiments, members in our lab would often chop genes in half and splice together a mouse gene and a human gene and create a hybrid, okay? Or they might take a serotonin receptor and put a series of mutations into it that makes it look a little bit more like a GABA receptor or another neurotransmitter receptor. All to say that those experiments alerted me to the way in which different genetic codes are read, and they're read and given a particular identity, whether it's a serotonin receptor or an acetylcholine receptor or whatever. But I was interested in exploring how that kind of reading of genetic code related to identity in human populations. And so I wanted to go to a society where there was very heavy importance on identity and where there was a lot of genetic research of the population. And that ultimately led me to look at the Middle East.
Yeah, so maybe you could say a little bit more about that. Why? I mean, I guess there are different places in which, you know, this is identity is being constructed or reconstructed through genomics and genetics, right? So what was it in particular about the Middle East, or how did you, I mean, sometimes this is very serendipitous, I suppose, with anthropological research, but I'm just, yeah, curious to know more about how you ended up in these particular places, Israel and Qatar as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, as you said, so part of it's, you know, somewhat contingent. I guess, you know, I didn't have a lot of exposure to the Middle East growing up. It's not like I had a personal or family connection to the Middle East or anything like that. But while I was in the UK, there were several wars that Israel was engaged in. The student body at the University of Cambridge, where I was very politically active. So I guess I was alerted to the way in which Israel and the critique of Zionism and identity and the justifications for the state itself were, you know, quite heavily debated. So that kind of alerted me to the politics of identity in Israel being fraught. And that's, you know, with anthropology, it's often the case that the countries that you're most foreign to are often the richest sites for interpretation. So, you know, the fact that I knew nothing about the place, I think probably helped me try to figure it out from first principles, rather than going there and having certain assumptions or certain sense of what's normal about the place. In terms of the second major site in the book is Qatar. It kind of was an add-on along the way, I would say. I was initially focused on Israel. And after starting my fieldwork in Israel, one of my dissertation supervisors, Steve Caton at Harvard, who's an expert in the Arab Gulf and in Yemen in particular, had suggested that perhaps I look at one of the Gulf societies, the UAE or Qatar or Bahrain, where they're quite wealthy and they're quite, they have quite a high degree of endogamy. They tend to marry along tribal lines. And for that reason, there tends to be a lot of inheritable disease in the population. And they've used a lot of their state resources to put a lot of money into biomedical development and particularly genetics research of the population to try and eliminate genetic disease. So I was already doing work in Israel on genetics and identity, and I was made aware of similar work going on in the Gulf. So I made a short research trip initially to Qatar to participate in a genomics conference. And while I was at the conference, I realized just how much was going on there in terms of a genome project, a national genome project of the Qatari citizens, a national biobank, and quite a lot of focus on the genetics of the population. So yeah, in short, it was sort of an interest that I cultivated somewhat by chance.
I'd like to jump in here to wonder, how would you describe your research methods, and how fundamentally were they different from the methods you used to study neuroscience, or they were not, maybe? The second question would be, how do you go about doing ethnography and anthropology?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, with science, it's generally hypothesis testing. So you tend to go in with a clear question and you test it, and you tend to get an answer whether your hypothesis is correct or not. With cultural anthropology, it tends to be more inductive. So you tend to have a more loosely defined question at the outset. And as you talk to people, interview people, hang out and observe, you tend to focus the question and it gets sharper. But I think that's an important distinction between the sciences and the social sciences, which is that your very question might be the wrong question if you're too committed to a particular focus. So cultural anthropology, the principal method is ethnographic research, which can be as unstructured as joining a tribe and living in a village with a group of people, or it can be as structured as focused interviews or content analysis of websites or social media outputs, which is, tremendously effective today.
Yeah, I guess we're asking you all these questions partly because I feel like, we have a very interdisciplinary kind of mission in NIST, and also, so some people just may have no idea what anthropologists do, right? And so I think it's, really interesting to hear more about, how you get to, something like a book like this. Yeah, so I guess, following up on that, maybe I should say also, we're happy to take questions from the audience too, and we can come back to those at the end. So if you do have any questions, put them in the Q&A, and we will ask them to Ian at an appropriate moment, probably later in the conversation. But yeah, so my question is really about what surprised you. I mean, I referred to kind of serendipity before. And, I think that's an element, there's certainly an element of that in all kind of ethnographic or anthropological research, but just wondering, and, I think there are certainly, reading the book, I feel like there were some moments that seemed to take you by surprise. So I was wondering, yeah, maybe if you could talk about, how that happened and what these surprises were and what you learned from them, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. I think because I came from the sciences and I went into this project with a pretty, I would say, probably a hypothesis that was maybe too tightly conceived. So in a sense, I went to Israel to see how Zionism was playing out at the level of the lab. I wanted to see how ideas about Jewish nationalism and the idea of the Jewish nation having grounding in genetics and in biological science. I wanted to try and find that somehow at the level of the bench, the lab bench. And in a way, the question was maybe over theorized, because it turns out that, there was somewhat ethnographically disappointing in a sense. When you read the book, you'll see that the genetics research that I describe in Israel was far less about nationalism, was far less about Jewish exceptionalism, but rather it was more configured by recent trends in genomic sciences and this progressive move towards personalized medicine. So in a sense, I was somewhat disappointed by the finding, because I had expected to find something. But I mean, this is why we do research, because the world doesn't always match up to our expectations. On the other hand, when I went to Qatar, I was actually surprised just how much nationalism was configuring genomics research. One example to give you a sense of just how much genomics is embedded in the sense of national history and heritage is that in one of the museums in Doha, they've now installed a DNA museum, like a sub-museum in the museum. So this is an example of where the state and its effort to tackle issues of genomic disease, but also to further an understanding of heritage, this has created these conditions where genomics is incredibly woven into the nation building efforts of the state. So in a sense, you get different proportionate degrees of nationalism playing out in the sciences.
And just to sort of quickly follow up on that, I mean, is this a sensitive topic within a place like, you know, I mean, you spoke about your outsider status a little bit before, and I'm just wondering, was there a sense that you, you know, maybe were an interloper in these spaces, or I'm curious, like, what your relationship to a place like, especially, I guess, Qatar, where you didn't at first intend to even go, right, as part of your research, or did that help you? Did that distance kind of help you, you think, in your research as well?
I think when I first went to Israel, I kind of moved there with plans to stay for a year, and I was a fellow at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Tel Aviv University. So I had a base at a university, and I approached the head of the National Biobank in Israel, and he agreed to have a meeting with me, and I explained my project to him. And when I explained that I had a background in biology and some experience doing experiments at the bench, and I saw that this caught his attention, I suggested that one way that I might be able to study the biobank and the activities of his lab would be to join as a sort of a volunteer or as a visiting scientist. So I think in that sense, having some background in the sciences gave me some credibility and legibility. It's not always the case that in different parts of the world, folks are familiar with cultural anthropology and why an anthropologist might want to study scientists in particular. A lot of people, when they hear of anthropology, they think of dinosaur bones or archaeology. They don't really know that social anthropology is the study of, you know, contemporary culture and societies. So I think the scientific credentials and sort of presenting an identity and some interests that overlap with the folks that you're interested in studying is helpful, and making that connection and having some shared interests. In Qatar, my research experience was a little bit different because I was making shorter trips. I made about four or five shorter trips, sometimes up to about 6 weeks each. But and these were usually around the time of year when one of the main biomedical institutions was hosting a genetics conference. So I think I often recommend to folks that are doing ethnographic research to try and attend conferences, because conferences are these intensified events where all of the actors and institutions involved will present what they've been doing over the past several years in this ultra condensed form. So you can get a tremendous amount of data that can orient you very, very quickly. But also at a conference, people are present and willing to meet new people. So it's also a really great place where a stranger can go up and introduce themselves, and people are generally very open and welcoming to it. So my experience is that, you know, folks generally were quite responsive in Qatar. And I didn't get a sense that what I was interested in studying was sensitive in itself. Perhaps the fact that I'm comparing states that don't have good diplomatic ties between each other would be more problematic for some folks than, let's say, the content that I'm exploring in either of the locations themselves.
Thank you, Ian. Since we already touched a little bit on the book, let's move closer to some of the core ideas which are centered on quite novel concept of genomic citizenship. So actually I went to Google more about this concept, but I couldn't find a lot of works except for yours. So how would you describe it, and how does it merge with other levels of citizenship, political, cultural, biological, ethnical, maybe there are some others, and actually how is the science of identity and citizenship produced?
Sure. I'm using genomic citizenship as a kind of an umbrella to encapsulate the various ways in which ethnic and national identities become content in the biological sciences, in genetics. So I'm interested in the way in which the nation becomes legible. I'm interested in the way in which ethnic groups are sorted out in the handling of genomic data. So this is not yet the way in which states decide who can and cannot become a citizen. But one of the interesting developments in previous years has been that on a couple of occasions, states have announced that this might be used as a way to decide who in fact belongs in the nation. So Kuwait announced several years ago that they would establish a genetic database of all of the citizens, and this could potentially be used to determine who has a legitimate ancestor as a citizen, who has biological connections or kin and that belong within the nation. So this hasn't thankfully developed yet as a policy, but Israel also announced that they may in the future use more genetic tests, and there are ongoing debates about how acceptable this is and also how useful it is, because as you know, if you've read the book, Jewish identity is not a genetic issue. It's transmitted matrilineally. So only people whose mothers are Jews are Jewish according to Jewish law. So there's a set of much more complex set of issues going on in Israel, all to say that it hasn't been implemented yet as a formal policy, but there's the potential for that.
So perhaps, I mean, you mentioned, I mean, that it sounds very much, and yeah, I mean, I guess I know that this is not something you would support, right? The idea of delimiting who is a citizen through genomics. So maybe you could say a little bit more about why that is. I mean, what would be the problem if we started organizing nation states around genetics?
I mean, different nation states around the world have very varying different policies about how inclusive they are and how open their borders are. So in my native country, Ireland, it's a republic. So anyone born on the island is automatically a citizen. So this is one form of citizenship. Other countries have a much heavier cultural emphasis that there's an expectation that you have either grandparents who are citizens or parents who are citizens, and this varies from country to country. I think the question might be less what ought to be the correct form of citizenship for all countries, but rather in what ways might genomics be influenced by the different prior political cultures. So I guess my conclusions from studying two different states in the Middle East would be that different countries will probably implement this very differently. It's already the case that genomic tests can say quite a lot about your ancestry. Whether that becomes utilized and implemented and part of the tools of controlling the border is probably going to be influenced far more by the contemporary political culture than by the science and the technology itself, which I think kind of alludes to kind of a broader point about the social study of science and technology, which is that it's not that these technologies will inevitably lead to certain policies and outcomes. It's not the fact that because we have genomic tests, they necessarily ought to lead to tests to determine who's a legitimate citizen or not, but rather that these technologies will be implemented in various different ways according to the different political climates. But I think in the context of COVID and what's been going on in recent years, I think countries are moving more towards closure and a defense of their borders and a turning inward. So in that context, I wouldn't be surprised if this were taken up by several states.
And is there anything? So yeah, I mean, this is going to be implemented in different ways. I mean that seems right. And I'm just wondering what is special about the Middle East in this respect? And maybe it's hard to generalize across your two examples, but yeah, I mean, is there something special about the way this is being taken up in the Middle East or in the two examples that you studied, and what is significant about these cases? What is, yeah.
I mean, in many ways, when I told folks in Israel that I was studying Qatar, they think of Qatar as a very, very different place. They don't see them as their cousins or anything like that. But both Israel and Qatar are post-British protectorates. They're both relatively young nation states. They have a multiracial population. They have a heavy emphasis on science and technology, in which they're quite advanced. But also, they both have the character of being an island, in the sense that Israel has very poor diplomatic relations with its neighbors on its borders. And Qatar, up until very recently, also was regionally isolated. So I think it's important to recognize that this kind of political isolation only serves to enhance the sense of national inclusion and the borders between the nation and its neighbors. So I think this is part of the intensification of national identity that that you can see in some of these biomedical developments.
Let's stay in this region for a little longer. So in your book, you also describe historical grounds of Jewish identity and the history of Zionism, and you have already touched a little bit on them. So this reminds us that ideas that link nature or biology to ethnicities and nations in some ways have been around for a long time. So what is new about genomic identity as opposed to previous versions of biological-based identity?
I suppose I would say that compared to, you know, say 20th century racism, which was in many ways a racism of outward appearances, okay? You could tell people looked different. They were a different race, a different nationality. You could tell by, you know, various physiological parameters that people were different. I think the science of genomics is a little bit more complicated because many of the differences that genomics can reveal are actually invisible differences. So on the one hand, there could be exclusion based on invisible differences. That might be one major difference. But the fact that genomics is also, you know, heavily enrolled in precision medicine projects and in eliminating genetic diseases, this also means that we may all end up with our genome sequenced sooner than we think, because by understanding more about our genomics, we might be able to predict future diseases that we might be susceptible to. So as much in the same way that racism went from something that was visible to invisible, I would say that healthcare is also in a similar transition from you're treated in the past when you have a symptom and you feel unwell. It's possible that in the case of genomics, that in the future we may in fact be more and more treated as risk carriers based on our genetic profile or other factors. So first of all, I think the technology's changed in significant ways, but also it's more pervasive. The fact that there are genome projects all around the world cataloging their populations, I think just the extent of its pervasiveness, and then also the power in which it can read not only our ancestry in terms of the past, but also in our medical futures. So I think it's a intensification of biological categorization that we see with genomics.
Yeah, I remember in your book, you mentioned that genomics and biobanking are becoming key sites for imagining national and ethnic communities in the contemporary Middle East, right? So why is it only genomics and biobanking? Why is it not some other underpinning, maybe political or social?
Oh, that's a great question, because that brings me to my next project. Actually, one of the things that I noticed in Israel is that nationalism is not just in genomics. In fact, it's in many other sites in the society. And while I was in Israel, I got interested in how national identity is also asserted through agriculture, and in particularly with winemaking, for example. So by marking the territory with vineyards, it often indicates Jewish settlement, because the resident Palestinians, who are a Muslim majority, grow far less grapes. So, you know, there are many ways in which technologies, for instance, in the context of winemaking, can mark the territory as having a particular national character. So it's not that genomics is special at all in terms of being the only incidence of nationalism playing out in technology. On the contrary, there are many ways in which you can see the nation being asserted in different forms. I think this is also an important point for scholars in anthropology and science and technology studies, which is that the technology doesn't have to be particularly technical to have political resonance and you know, importance for how national identity is asserted.
Yeah, I should note here that Ian has actually made a documentary film about winemaking in Israel, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I've just finished making a documentary film recently about this topic, and yeah, it really built on from the project in Israel, which is that I was interested in seeing how different national imaginaries play out in in Israel. And when I found out about winemaking and the symbolism of grapes and vineyards, I started investigating that, and it took me more towards the social study of religion as well, because many of the religious Jewish winemakers also believe that the return to Israel is the realization of biblical prophecies. So this is another level of how different texts or different codes are read to have specific meaning in the context of a young nation, whether it's reading a genetic code and affirming an ancestral connection, or whether it's reading a biblical text in Hebrew and through that hermeneutic process seeing the manifestation of these prophecies coming true. So I think there's some logical connection between the projects in that sense.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I hadn't really made that connection before, even though I know both of your work on both of these topics. But that makes a lot of sense. I want to go back perhaps then just to some of the maybe discontinuities here, and especially this concept of invisibility you talked about, and what's special about genomics, and how we might think about that. And you talk a lot in the book also about kind of non-coding DNA as well, that in fact, not only is it invisible, but in some of these cases, the genes or the parts of our genome that are actually being kind of tracked are things that have no phenotypic effect, right? No physiological effect. And so, I mean, is this something you see as critical also to the way in which this is playing into nationalism, this kind of invisible there's something invisible about this in our bodies that is, that is coming to shape who's in and who's out in some sense?
Yeah, this is a problem that I was quite interested in at the outset, in fact, and other scholars have written about this topic, particularly Nadia Abu al-Hajj's book, The Genealogical Science, where she talks more about Jewish ancestry and how exactly it is that non-coding DNA can be a sign of nothing important, but also of essential importance if it can be used as evidence of a historical connection to a place. So there is this kind of ambiguity about the importance of DNA. If it doesn't code for a physical trait, it doesn't give you curly hair or dark skin, then is it really important? And I think this gets to the earlier point I was making about the conditioning effects of the national context, that if it's important for it to make a difference, then it will be read as meaningful. If it's less important for those sequences to be the basis of distinctions between groups, then they'll probably be discarded. So I would say that the important point that I would emphasize is that the decisions about inclusion and exclusion and of division and merging of different groups originates in the political realm and in the realm of political ideology, rather than as a necessary consequence of certain genetic inscriptions.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it sort of circulates through, I guess, is sort of, I think, one of the arguments you're making here, right? And maybe that, I mean, I think one of the things that was interesting to me when I was reading the kind of Israel parts of your book was also how this, in fact, how genomic identity or genetic identity often seems to not line up. This was a little bit of a moment of surprise for me, and not line up with traditional and particularly religious versions of, I mean, you alluded to this a little bit before, but yeah, I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, and in particular, why it doesn't line up, and also, what that might mean for the kind of future of how this might play out, right? This idea of constructing genomics, constructing identity on genomics.
Yeah, sure. So with Judaism, it's quite interesting because it has somewhat of a tribal character, which is that distinction to Christianity, where nobody's born a Christian. You have to be symbolically born into the community through baptism. With Judaism, you're born a Jew naturally if your mother is Jewish. So there's at the first principles level, there's a biological basis for the transmission of identity. But when some of the genetic studies were tracing genetic markers, they often looked on the Y chromosome to look at patrilineal descent. So in some ways, there's a potential contradiction between the study of ancestry up the male line, even though in the political present, Jewish identity is only reproduced from mother to their children. So there's a potential conflict in studying genetics from both through the descent of both parents. But I mean, the important point, I suppose, is that a genetic test cannot say if you're Jewish or not, because it cannot say whether your parent converted to another religion or not, which would, for the purposes of citizenship in Israel, would invalidate your claim. So there's a contradiction between how Jewishness is reproduced authentically according to Jewish religious law, and then these measurements that can say something about ancestry, but can't say anything about your contemporary identity. So whether you identify as Jewish and follow the religious laws and how you live your life cannot be determined by DNA. So this is the important contradiction between the natural facts about how Jewishness is reproduced and the science of ancestry.
Now I would like to move our discussion a little bit to a modern realm. While I was reading this book, I was captured by the way how you put forward a nicely balanced account of the collection of genetic and genomic information and personalized genomics. And this is relevant not only to the Middle East, but also globally. So I know that you mentioned already this in the book, but more information about the benefits of genetic databases for population researchers, healthcare systems, pharmaceutical companies might be helpful for our audience. And also, do you see any potential risks?
Yeah, so I guess in the context of genomics, we had about 20 years ago the first human genome, and the idea when the first human genome was sequenced was that we've cracked the code of life and we'll know all of the secrets of biology and we'll be able to treat so many diseases. And in many ways, the science didn't live up to that promise. And in recent years, there's been more of a focus on generating what are called reference genomes for specific populations. So one of the reasons for this is the fact that what might look like a disease mutation in one group of people might not actually be a meaningful indication of a disease in a different group. And so what that means is that every ethnic group needs its own genome sequenced so that you can understand what are the background variants that are not necessarily pathogenic, so that you can essentially read the signal from the background noise and determine what genetic markers might actually be indicative of disease. So there's been a move, let's say, from the sequencing the human in general towards reference genomes for ethnic groups, and this often takes place in the context of nation states, so national genome projects, which may or may not have subsets of reference ethnic groups within the nation. But I think one of the things I've learned over the past couple of years, probably since I've winding up this project, is that the move is probably going from continuing on this trajectory towards the individual. So rather than it being the generic human or the ethnic group, we're probably moving towards personalized genomics and more treatment on the individual level, with attention to other factors like diet and lifestyle, and also family history. So I think the move is towards the individual.
And maybe I can ask you a little bit more. I mean, this sort of continues that, I think, about biobanks in particular. And I think, again, one of the things that kind of surprised me in the book was, I mean, you're quite explicit, I think, in some parts in talking about how biobanks may actually be a little bit becoming sort of obsolete in some ways. And I think especially in the Israeli context, it seems like it was started, more than a decade ago, and then it's kind of, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like it's just kind of sitting there in some ways. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit, given all of this, right, given that we're shaping it seems in some ways we're shaping our ideas about identity more around reference genomes or whatever, then what what's wrong with the biobanks in some ways, right? What's going on there, and what does that tell us?
This sort of brings us to the issue of ethics, and with IRB and with medical research, it's very important that when a donor of a biological sample signs away their blood or their tissue sample, they give certain permissions, but those permissions that they give don't always anticipate what new technologies will be able to do. And I think this is part of what is at issue with the Israeli biobank, which is that they also have fairly strict genetic privacy laws in Israel, but essentially there are a lot of biological samples that weren't previously authorized for genomic sequencing. So in many ways, this limits what can be done with the samples. It's not the case with all biobanks, but it raises the question as to when we're writing our IRBs and collecting samples, what future technologies are we anticipating, and the extent to which we even could anticipate what might be the potential benefits down the road.
Since you have already emphasized on the necessity of regulations in the area of ethics or of genomics, of genetics, right? Do you foresee any practical or policy implications of your book, specifically of the concepts described there? For example, does it inform how the accessibility of national genetic data should be regulated? For example, can healthcare services or insurance companies have access to the health data of a customer? What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly the case that what they're doing in Qatar is absolutely fantastic in terms of helping eliminate genetic disease and suffering. So there's no question that we should be, hugely supportive of genomic research, particularly genomics research that can completely eliminate these rare genetic diseases that many people suffer from. So I think, that should be supported. There's also the issue of genomic privacy, and this in many ways is also a political question, in the sense that in the country that's very or would say that the citizens are very independently minded, like in the US, for example, I think it would be very difficult to pass a law that would say mandate the collection of biological samples of the population. I think this would be hugely problematic and would arouse tremendous opposition. In other countries where there's much more of a sense of collective welfare, collective responsibility, you might have more voluntary participation in these kinds of efforts. So I think I would sort of say again that it depends on the context, and it depends which society we're looking at. In other words, I don't think there's a one size fits all, at least in the context of policy making.
Yeah, and right. Yeah, and it's going to depend a lot on what context we're talking about. And maybe that kind of dovetails a little bit with a question that we have from the audience. This is in fact from one of your colleagues in sociology, Francis Lim, who's asking about, you talk about this a little bit in the book too, that especially the idea that in Israel, the science that's being done, you mentioned this, kind of belongs to this kind of international genomics and personalized medicine movement in some ways. And so the question is really about, is there a tension here between the local and the global? And I think Francis is specifically referring to Qatar here, and whether there are kind of sort of nationalistic science that has arisen there that might be in conflict with a kind of, or intention, maybe not say conflict, intention with a kind of more internationalist vision of genomics. And yeah, I think that ties into some of the questions we've had about kind of, these reference genomes and versus, this kind of global sense of genomics. So is there a tension? What is it?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. Thanks, Francis. I suppose in one of the ways I distinguish what's going on in Qatar and Israel in the book is that Israel is much more of a neoliberal market-driven society, where I would say more and more of the genomic research is taking place in private companies. So that's an important characterization for Israel. In Qatar, it's heavily state-funded, heavily state-run. The state which supports Qatar Foundation funds a huge amount of this work. So in a sense, it's far more state-driven. So that's an important distinction between the two contexts for sure. In terms of the globalization, there are also interesting distinctions in that the biobank in Israel is a pretty low budget affair, but it's open to share samples with researchers around the world. So in a sense, the science of ethnicity and the science of different Jewish ethnic groups can continue even though with the absence of tremendous state funds and state directives and expectations. So the Israeli biobank is globally networked somewhat, but somewhat informally, let's say. The Qatari researchers, I mean, a huge proportion of them aren't Qatari. Many of them are foreigners who have come to collaborate and work with them to help build up their hospitals and genomics research. So the research in Qatar, although it's heavily funded and controlled by the state, it's also incredibly internationalized in terms of its collaborations. So there are these tensions that play out differently in the two different contexts.
Thanks. Yeah. Maybe, I mean, I think we're moving towards the end of the conversation here. So if people do have other questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. But I wanted to kind of move towards where you're going next in some sense with this research. And in particular, I know that you've been working not only on making films about wine, but also on the Singapore context and, you know, working with scientists here in Singapore as well, and presumably also thinking about some of these questions of genomic identity and genomic citizenship. And this also, I think, links to a question from Grace Yor, which is in the chat, that is about, yeah, how does this play out in Singapore? And particularly, she says, particularly considering Singapore as a smart, or is talked about as a smart nation, and that this is referenced all the time. How does this kind of play out as well? So I'm curious to hear about how your research has moved from the Middle East to Singapore, and you know how this is playing out here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Grace, for the very apt question. Look, Singapore has got similar research going on, but Singapore is quite different in the sense of its nationalism is quite distinct. So Singapore has similarities with both Israel and Qatar, in that it's also a relatively young, multiracial nation, a post-British protectorate that's highly advanced in science and technology. But compared to Israel, for example, it's a far more harmonious, multiracial nation. And compared to Qatar, it's far less unequal, let's say. And so there's much more of a integration between the minorities. And I would say that the question of genetics and identity is, for those reasons, somewhat less politically sensitive. So it's the second thing I would say is that, you know, Singapore functions and administers the population according to the CMIO model, which is the Chinese, Malay, Indian, and other model. And this plays out in the context of genetics research as well. And so in many ways, it makes it unproblematic, the question of the national genome, because, you know, there's a sort of commonsensical relation towards the population, that we're a diverse society and that each group has its own specific needs. And these are being tackled by the Helios Biobank, which is the Health for Life in Singapore project, which is associated with LKC Medicine. And so they're doing precisely this work on the genomics and the health outcomes across the major ethnic groups. So it's, as I said previously, it's important to recognize how the conditioning context of state nationalism plays out in the context of genetics. And in this sense, we kind of see the policies of racial harmony playing out with the research in Helios. So I've been involved in that, and I've had 2 postdocs who've published 2 articles on this topic already, and yeah, we're interested to continue to do research on this topic in Singapore.
Yeah, and perhaps just as a kind of final question, I mean, if there's anything else we want to mention, or just interested in, yeah, where this is going next, and what you kind of want to do next with kind of thinking about this research, and yeah.
Yeah, sure. So in many ways, we've just finished two fairly large projects that took a few years. One was writing about Helios, and one was writing about another genome project, which is Genome Asia 100K. So this is one of the world's largest genome projects. It's based at NTU, and its goal is to generate reference genomes for the major Asian ethnicities. So I've been writing about them and working with them and collaborating with them also, and helping advise on issues of ethics, and then some of these anthropological issues about what defines an ethnic group, and you know, what's the best way to collaborate internationally, and you know, understand the complexities about identity cross-culturally. But they're doing excellent work, and I look forward to continuing to collaborate with them, and hopefully there'll be interesting things to say about interesting things to say about how genome projects also transcend national boundaries, which is exactly what Genome Asia is doing. So if the take home from this conversation and from the book and looking at what's going on in Singapore that's similar is that each context will have different configurations of genomic research, and genomics is doesn't have inevitable outcomes, but the technologies are downstream of our political culture and our policy making. So in that sense, it's quite optimistic that there's nothing inevitable here.
Great, thank you so much, Ian. And I just want to say again, congratulations on the book. And you know, I learned a lot from it, and you know, we look forward to seeing the results of the research that you're doing now in the near future. So thanks to Una too for participating in this conversation, and yeah, I hope to see you all again at future Fellows in Focus events. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Halam.